No one believed the homeless man when he entered the plane, shouting that the aircraft was going to crash. But as soon as the police were called, everyone was stunned by a terrifying discovery. The sky was painted orange as Joseph woke up beneath the awning of an abandoned building near Houston's International Airport. Waking up to the sound of airplane engines had become a habit, something he was used to, yet it never ceased to amaze him. Despite his harsh reality, he nurtured an improbable dream: to fly. Joseph spent his days watching the comings and goings at the airport. His routine was simple, almost monotonous, rummaging through trash bins for something to eat, wandering streets where his presence went unnoticed, and occasionally losing himself in daydreams while watching planes streak across the sky. He imagined the lives on board: business executives, families on vacation, lovers reuniting. What must it be like up there, he wondered, as the wind carried the scent of jet fuel. That night, however, his routine was broken. The cold was sharper than usual, and Joseph sought a corner to shield himself. He ventured into a dimly lit alley, finding a spot among old crates. As he settled in, he heard voices. Two men were speaking in hushed tones, but their proximity allowed him to catch critical fragments. "It's all set. The backpack is ready," one of them said, his voice rough, almost guttural. "And the detonator?" asked the other, younger, with a faint northeastern accent. "It's automatic. Once the plane reaches the right altitude, boom." Joseph's heart raced. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. He shrank further into the shadows, his eyes straining to see the men's faces, but the alley's darkness cloaked them. "The flight leaves at 10. We have to make sure nothing goes wrong," the older man continued, his tone chillingly calm. They both chuckled, stifling their laughter as they walked away. Joseph remained frozen, his breath caught in his throat. When the street returned to silence, he leaned against the filthy wall, the echo of their words pounding in his mind. A bomb, a plane. What if it was true? He tried to dismiss the thought, but couldn't. Why me? Who would believe me? I'm just a homeless man, invisible to everyone. The weight of responsibility settled on him like an anchor. He knew something terrible was about to happen, but doubt gnawed at him. Report it? To whom? What if no one believed him, or worse, if he got arrested? As the night wore on, Joseph stayed there, his gaze fixed on nothing, paralyzed by fear and conscience. The distant roar of another plane taking off pierced the silence, filling him with a strange mix of hope and despair. As the freezing wind made his frail body shiver, he realized that night would mark an irreversible change in his life. The first light of dawn found Joseph sitting on a curb near the airport. His sunken eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the day's first flights were taking off. The previous night's conversation echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself he'd misunderstood, something deep within him screamed. It was real. A plot to destroy a plane. A bomb. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of cold and hunger. Maybe it's just paranoia, he thought, but doubt wouldn't let him rest. Staring at the airport from a distance, Joseph made a decision: to watch. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he believed that if he stayed vigilant, he might find something. Joseph positioned himself strategically, where he could see passengers entering the terminal. Amid suitcases, backpacks, and hurried faces, he strained to spot anything unusual. Then, in the distance, he recognized one of the men from the night before. The man had the same brisk walk, the same sturdy build. He was carrying a black backpack. Joseph's heart pounded. His hands trembled as he tried to think clearly. "It's him. It's the backpack. I know it is." He took a step toward the terminal, but stopped. "And what am I going to do? Shout there's a bomb? They'll laugh at me. They'll throw me out before I can explain." Anxiety paralyzed him. For several minutes, Joseph stood there, staring at the airport entrance, while the man disappeared into the crowd. Guilt began to gnaw at him. If I do nothing and something happens, it'll be my fault. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, he ran toward the entrance, crossing the street without caring about the blaring horns of cars. He had to be heard, had to warn someone. "A bomb!" Joseph shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate as he neared the terminal's exterior. "They're going to blow up the plane!" People around him paused briefly, some curious, others simply confused. A security guard approached quickly. "What's going on here?" the uniformed man asked, his expression skeptical. "There's a bomb, I heard them talking." Joseph gestured wildly, his voice growing louder. "A man with a black backpack. He's going to put the bomb on the plane." The guards surrounded him, trying to calm him as onlookers moved away. One of them placed a firm hand on Joseph's shoulder. "Sir, calm down. You can't cause a scene here." The voice was firm, but there was contempt in his tone. Joseph shrank under the man's gaze, which treated him like just another crazy vagrant. "I'm telling the truth," he insisted, but it was too late. The crowd had resumed its routine, and the guards were determined to escort him out. He was shoved back toward the street, unceremoniously. With scraped knees and wounded pride, Joseph felt anger rising within him. They didn't believe him. No one believed him. But something deep in his soul urged him to keep going. He couldn't give up. Sitting on the curb, Joseph watched the terminal like a cornered animal. "If they won't listen to me, I'll make them listen. I can't let that plane take off." His gaze hardened. Resolute, he stood and started walking toward the terminal again, this time with a clear goal: to get inside the airport, no matter the cost. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew he might be arrested or even attacked. But as he moved forward, his thoughts were fixed on one thing. If he didn't act, hundreds of lives would be lost. And that was a burden he couldn't bear. The terminal gates loomed larger as he approached. The chaos in his mind contrasted with the apparent order of the place. Joseph took a deep breath, crossed the glass doors, and disappeared into the crowd. He was determined to stop the disaster, no matter the cost. The commotion in the airport terminal began as soon as Joseph burst through the automatic doors. The sound of his sandals slapping against the polished floor echoed as he weaved through the passengers, dodging luggage and carts. His breathing was heavy, and sweat dripped down his face. "I have to stop this," he repeated to himself, like a desperate mantra. "There's a bomb!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, in the middle of the bustling crowd. "They're going to blow up the plane!" At first, curious glances turned into expressions of concern. Some people stopped to stare, while others backed away, fearing a fight or something worse. Security personnel, alerted by the growing chaos, began moving toward him. Joseph knew he had little time before they detained him, but he pressed on. "A man with a black backpack. He's going to blow up the plane." The desperation in his voice was palpable, but it also unsettled the crowd. Some passengers whispered among themselves, trying to figure out whether he was a threat or just another disturbed man. He headed toward the boarding area, ignoring the security officers shouting for him to stop. Joseph leapt over a divider, knocking over signage with a crash that drew even more attention. Alarms started blaring, and chaos erupted. Passengers near the boarding gates backed away as he approached. A few staff members tried to block him, but he was quick, dodging them with the determination of someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. When he reached the gate for the 10 a.m. flight, he saw passengers already boarding. He sprinted toward the jet bridge, connecting the terminal to the plane. "Stop the plane, don't let it take off!" Joseph screamed, his voice barely audible over the sirens and the orders being barked by the guards chasing him. Inside the plane, the flight attendants were preparing for takeoff when they heard the commotion coming from the jet bridge. Joseph's face appeared, frantic as he yelled for anyone who would listen. "There's a bomb here! They're trying to bring the plane down!" The passengers, already seated, were shocked. A wave of anxiety and fear swept through the cabin like wildfire. A mother clutched her child's hand tightly. A man in a suit checked his watch nervously. Some people pulled out their phones, ready to record the chaos. The security guards finally caught up with Joseph, grabbing him by the arms. He struggled with all his strength, kicking and screaming, "You have to listen to me. I'm serious. The bomb is on this plane. Are you really going to let this happen?" The guards overpowered him at last, dragging him out of the aircraft. Yet his words lingered in the minds of the passengers. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. What if he's telling the truth? What if this really is an attack? Why would he do this for no reason? Outside, Joseph was shoved against a wall, surrounded by uniformed men. His body was exhausted, but his voice remained firm. "I heard them talking. They're going to blow up the plane once it reaches altitude. You have to believe me." The security team exchanged uneasy glances. There was no immediate evidence to back up Joseph's story, but the growing tension among the passengers pressured the airport authorities to act. A businessman who had disembarked from the plane approached them. "Let me say something," he began, addressing the guards. "This man could be crazy or he could be right, but if he's talking about a bomb, don't you think it's worth checking out?" The commotion attracted more onlookers, forcing the security team to reconsider. One of the officers grabbed his radio and notified the bomb squad. The now evacuated plane was surrounded and the search began. Meanwhile, Joseph sat in a cold, sterile room, handcuffed to a chair. His heart was still racing as if he were back in the middle of the chaos. Two men, seemingly police officers, entered the room with folders in hand, their eyes scanning him with skepticism. "Joseph, is that right?" one of them asked, his tone firm but not hostile. Joseph nodded, swallowing hard. "So, tell me again, who did you see and what exactly did you hear?" The officer's tone suggested he was looking for inconsistencies. "I heard two men at night in an alley near the airport," Joseph began, his voice hoarse from shouting. "They were talking about a bomb, about a plane, about blowing it up once it reached a certain altitude. One of them, I saw him this morning, with a black backpack. That's why I ran. I had to warn someone." The officer frowned. Before he could ask another question, his radio crackled to life. He listened for a few moments, his expression shifting. Without a word, he shot a glance at his colleague and left the room. On the plane, the meticulous search reached its climax. One of the agents opened the bathroom door and noticed something out of place, a black backpack carefully hidden behind the toilet. He approached it cautiously, using tools to check for explosives. The persistent beeping of the detector confirmed their worst fears. The backpack contained a bomb. The lead officer called it in. "We've got a real threat. Device confirmed." Passengers and staff, evacuated to a safe distance, watched anxiously. The once busy terminal was now suffused with a heavy silence, broken only by the hum of radios and the commands of bomb squad specialists. Inside, a flight attendant approached the officers. She looked nervous, as if remembering something important. I think I saw something odd," she said hesitantly. "A man boarded with a similar backpack. He was in a hurry and went straight to the bathroom, but when he came out, he didn't have the backpack. I asked if he needed help, and he said he forgot something and left." Her account triggered another alert. Security reviewed the surveillance footage, confirming what Joseph had described. A man in a black jacket, carrying the backpack, entered the plane hurriedly and exited a few minutes later with empty hands. Back in the security room, Joseph fidgeted nervously. He imagined his story being dismissed, that he had been written off as another false alarm. The door suddenly opened, and the officer from earlier walked in, his demeanor changed. "Joseph," he began, pulling up a chair to sit. "We found the backpack." Joseph's heart skipped a beat. The officer continued, "It was a bomb. You were right." Joseph didn't know how to react. Relief washed over him, but the emotional toll left him speechless. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, unsure of what to say. "We're going to need your help," the officer said, his tone softer now. "Do you remember any more details? Clothes, voices, anything that can help us identify these men?" Joseph recounted everything, leaving no detail out. The officers hung on his every word, scribbling notes as he spoke. Outside, the news was beginning to spread. Passengers whispered about the man who shouted in the terminal and saved the plane. Those who had dismissed him as a lunatic began to see him in a different light. "He knew," they murmured. When the press arrived, cameras captured the tension among the officers, the isolation of the aircraft, and the anxious faces of passengers and staff. Slowly, questions began to emerge about the man who had sounded the alarm. Hours later, Joseph was led out of the room, this time without handcuffs. He walked through the hallways, escorted by police officers, as curious eyes followed him. As he passed through the terminal, some people began to clap. He was stunned, unsure of how to react. For the first time in years, he felt seen. The officer escorting him leaned in and whispered, "You saved many lives today. This will be recognized." Joseph didn't respond, but inside, something was changing. That day, marked by chaos and tension, would be remembered as the moment he stopped being invisible. The days following the airport chaos were intense. With the detailed descriptions Joseph provided and the security camera footage, the individuals behind the attack were quickly identified and arrested in a coordinated police operation. Joseph played a critical role in the process, identifying the men in a lineup. His testimony was key in confirming the terrorists' identities and dismantling their plan. News of the arrests spread rapidly, further cementing Joseph's bravery. The public now knew that the man who had shouted in the terminal not only saved lives, but also helped bring the perpetrators of a terrorist act to justice. "Unlikely hero thwarts terrorist attack," the headlines read, while social media exploded with support and admiration. Amid the camera flashes and emotional interviews, Joseph found himself at the center of attention. At first, he felt uncomfortable with all the commotion. Accustomed to being invisible, he didn't know how to handle the questions, the stares, or even the praise. But as days passed, something inside him began to shift. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't treated with disdain or suspicion. His story touched thousands of people. The internet was flooded with messages of support and offers to help. People shared videos and images of his courageous act at the airport, turning him into a symbol of determination and selflessness. Then the airline involved in the attempted attack did something that changed his life yet again. Recognizing his bravery and inspired by his story, the company's CEO publicly announced they would offer Joseph a job in the maintenance department. He accepted, his heart heavy with emotion, but also full of hope. Working in aircraft maintenance was more than Joseph had ever dreamed of for himself. He quickly learned the trade, showing dedication and deep respect for the work. Every piece of metal he handled brought him closer to the dream he had cherished since the days he spent watching planes in the sky. His story continued to attract attention. Reporters from other countries wanted to interview him. Filmmakers wanted to document his life. Then, an unexpected invitation arrived, an offer to join a training program to become a flight attendant. At first, the idea seemed absurd to him, but Joseph knew it represented something bigger, a chance to achieve the impossible, to fly. During training, he faced challenges he had never imagined, adapting to rules, learning safety protocols, memorizing instructions. But Joseph never backed down. Every step brought him closer to a goal he had barely dared to dream of: to be aboard an aircraft, not as a passenger, but as part of the crew. The big day arrived. Joseph wore his flight attendant uniform with a mix of pride and emotion. He was nervous, but as he stepped onto the plane, the weight of everything he had endured lifted. While passengers boarded, he smiled at each of them, knowing that not long ago, No one would have even looked him in the eye. During the flight, the crew surprised him with a special moment. They invited him to the cockpit. As he sat in the co-pilot's seat, gazing at the vastness of the sky before him, Joseph couldn't hold back his tears. The hum of the engines, the blinking lights of the controls, the infinite horizon. Everything felt so real, so unbelievable. "You know, Joseph," the captain said, glancing at him, "you've already been to the skies in a different way. Now you're here, living it fully. You deserve every second of this." Joseph smiled, discreetly wiping his face. The feeling was indescribable. That moment was more than the fulfillment of a dream. It was confirmation that his life had changed forever. Back on the ground, as passengers disembarked, one of them approached and shook his hand. "Thank you for everything, Joseph. You didn't just save the plane that day. You saved so many lives, including mine. My family was on that flight." Joseph simply nodded, speechless. But deep down, he knew this journey wasn't just about him. It was about proving that even in the most unlikely circumstances, anyone could make a difference. That day, Joseph wasn't just a flight attendant. He was a hero among us. The sky shone brightly over the airport. Joseph, now accustomed to his routine as a flight attendant, walked through the bustling terminal. His immaculate uniform reflected the transformation of his life. Every detail, from the badge bearing his name to the smiles he received from passengers, was a reminder of how far he had come. Joseph had grown used to flying, but he never stopped marveling. The silence while gazing out the window, the endless blue of the sky, the steady hum of the engines. It was as if, with every flight, he reclaimed a piece of something life had once taken from him. On a seemingly ordinary flight, as Joseph moved through the aisles serving passengers, a middle-aged woman called him over with a smile. "You're Joseph, right?" she asked, her eyes shining. Joseph paused, surprised. In the first few months, he had gotten used to being recognized, but it happened less often now. "Yes, that's me," he replied with a shy smile. "I need to tell you something," the woman began, holding his hand. "My daughter was on the flight you saved. She was on her way to visit family in São Paulo. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have her with me today." Joseph's eyes filled with tears. The woman continued. "She told me about the desperation at the airport, about the moment you shouted. You risked everything for people you didn't even know. That's something my family will never forget." Joseph nodded, swallowing hard. "I just did what needed to be done," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But hearing this, knowing I made a difference, it means so much." The woman squeezed his hand before he continued down the aisle. Joseph realized this wasn't just another story. It was proof that by saving those people, he had also saved himself, a life he once thought was lost forever. Later, during the crew's rest period, Joseph gazed out the window, watching the clouds glide softly beneath the plane. His mind wandered. He thought of the days when he was just a shadow roaming the streets, surviving on the fringes of a society that seemed not to care. Now he was here, flying above the clouds, not just as a passenger, but as someone who was part of the crew, a symbol of everything he had achieved. Most importantly, he was living proof that no one is irrelevant, that everyone can find redemption. Weeks later, Joseph was invited to speak at an event organized by the airline for its employees. It was a ceremony honoring aviation professionals, but that day, Joseph was the center of attention. Standing before an audience filled with pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, and executives, he stepped onto the stage, nervous but determined. He began simply, "A few years ago, I lived on the streets, invisible to everyone. I spent my days watching planes take off and land, dreaming of one day being up there but never believing it could happen." The room was silent. Every eye was on him. That night, when I heard those words in the alley, I hesitated. I thought, who would believe me? What could I possibly do? He paused, taking a deep breath. But something inside me knew that if I did nothing, the price would be far greater than I could bear. He looked at the audience, his voice trembling with emotion. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who chose to act when the chance came. And that's something all of us can do. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, or what others think of you. What matters is what you do when it counts. Applause filled the room, but Joseph continued. Today, I see every takeoff as a symbol of hope. Every flight reminds me that the impossible can be achieved, and that when we act with courage, we not only change the world around us, but also transform ourselves. The audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some were crying, others smiling proudly. Joseph stood under the stage lights, feeling the weight of the journey he had taken and the relief of knowing he had achieved something he never thought possible. A sense of belonging. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.